Recording. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar during CSW 66. And in the name of the NGO Committee on the Status of Women Vienna, and also in the name of the NGO Committee on Sustainable Development Vienna and her chair, Ingeborg Geier, and also the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, Anna Alvasi del Frate. And I welcome most warmly our panelists, starting with Emily Yozell, who will be our moderator, Jojo Meta, who will introduce the topic, Deanna Ziller, Patricia Madrigal Cordero, and Stephen Donziger. So please, Emily, you do have already the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna. And good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you for participating. This is the methodology that we have agreed to is that each presenter will take about 15 minutes to present their topics, and then we will allow for questions and answers for the remaining of the session. So we will hold questions until the final, but you can make comments in the chat as you'd like. I just want to thank so much Evelyn for pulling us all together in this, and confess that this is the first time I've ever moderated a Zoom, so please bear with me at my beginner's novice experimentation.
I join you as a novice.
Okay, so today our first speaker is Jojo Meta, and Jojo is the co-founder of Stop Ecocide, which was founded 5 years ago, jointly with Polly Higgins. And Stop Ecocide's main purpose is to establish ecocide as a formal crime through the International Criminal Court system. She's the key spokesperson and executive director of Ecocide International, and she, in the few years that she's been leading this movement, they now have teams in 15 countries, websites in 9 languages, and Jojo's been coordinating the legal developments, diplomatic actions, and I feel very honored to have her with us today. She's also convener of the independent panel for a legal definition of ecocide. She's based in the UK. She graduated from Oxford and University in London, and she has a wide, broad experience through communications, on-ground environmental campaigning, etc. So I will look forward to learning more about Ecocide as a collaborative woman-led movement addressing protection of our Mother Earth. So Jojo, thank you, and please take the lead.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and lovely to be taking part in this Commission on the Status of Women Week event. I'd like to briefly introduce the rationale and the progress of the work to criminalise threats of the worst harms to nature, which are increasingly referred to as ecocide at the international level. And I'll be discussing criminalising ecocide as a critical legal framing piece to deter and prevent harm, and to support the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. I'll also talk about how the consensus legal definition of ecocide, which emerged last year, enables this to work in practice. And perhaps finish with a few words on, as Emily highlighted, how ecocide is a collaborative movement. It's a women's led movement and addresses protection of Mother Earth. So to begin with, I think we are probably all very familiar with a feeling of frustration in the recent years that has been increasing with every international report and conference that takes place in regard to protection for the climate and for the environment in the situation we're in of global emergency. So both from emerging from COP26 last year and from the IPCC report that's recently come out, there's a real sense that action is happening, but very slowly, and that we're not moving at the pace or with the sort of impact that we need to actually address the urgency of the global climate and ecological crisis. And you know, we would say that there's potentially a really quite a simple key reason for this, and it's a very human one. It really comes down to human psychology on one level, which is that we tend not to change our habits, our established habits, unless external circumstances force us to, or unless we're legally required to do so. And so what we would say is that while there are fantastic targets, goals, and policies recommended by the Paris Agreement, coming out of also the UN Environment Assembly recently, and right now being discussed in Geneva around the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, full of fantastic policy recommendations, targets, great inclusion recommendations, and so on. But what we don't see is an enabling condition that can actually accelerate all of this action, so that instead of playing the same game a little bit better, we actually start to play it differently. And this is where we believe a law of ecocide comes into the picture. To criminalize serious harm to nature at the highest level gives us an outer parameter, or a kind of a guardrail or a safety rail, if you will, that, you know, within which the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements and all of these hugely well-intended and deliberated upon policies can actually be corralled into more rapid action. And looking at the definition of ecocide, which emerged last year from the independent panel convened by our foundation, we can see that we actually have a potential very effective lens that could be used, a sort of framework, if you like, that could be used, and through which all the different sectors that need to be moving forward with protection of the environment can potentially look. And one of the beauties of the definition that emerged from that work last year is that the core text of it is so concise that it actually fits on the back of a business card. And I will read it to you now. So according to this group of 12 legal experts from around the world who worked for 6 months on bringing together a definition that could practically be used at the political level to move forward a possible 5th international crime, the core text is simply this: ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Bear with me just one moment. I'm on a meeting, Mum.
Yeah, okay.
And I'll talk to you in a bit.
Yeah.
That was my darling mother knocking on the door there. So I'll continue. So the key, there are many things that could be said about this definition, and one could talk for a long time about it, but I will just summarize 3 key elements that are important about this definition. So firstly, it aims to capture the most severe and worst harms to the environment. So severe and either widespread or long-term harms, because when we're aiming at the international level, which we believe is very important in order to set this kind of foundational piece and sort of legal and moral framework in place, obviously the harms that must be addressed at that level need to be quite serious. The second threshold, though, is that acts must be unlawful or wanton. And it's interesting because one might think that we also need to criminalize things that are currently permitted. But if we put that word unlawful in, what we're doing is acknowledging that there is an existing body of law that varies from country to country, and that a lot of serious damage to nature actually happens in breach of existing laws, which are either not enforced enough or difficult to enforce, or the political will isn't there. So effectively, this can strengthen all of the existing law, but because of the word wanton in there, unlawful or wanton, this also enables us to potentially capture acts which may be lawful, but the severity of the destruction that they will cause is disproportionate and severe, and therefore that can also come under this definition. And the third element, which is really important in the context of deterrence and prevention, is that this is framed as a crime of endangerment. It is acts which are committed with the knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of the severe harm happening. And this is really important because ultimately, we're not, I mean, much as the justice for the victims of crimes that involve environmental destruction is very important, what we're ultimately aiming to do is to protect the ecosystems of our planet and to protect the natural world so that we can move forward in harmony with nature. And so deterrence and prevention is really ultimately the key aim of this, as it is with criminal law, generally speaking. But there is also an example, probably more than one, but the obvious one comes under war crimes, where directing an attack at a civilian population is a crime in and of itself, whatever happens to that population. And this definition is phrased in a bit of a similar way. In other words, what it does is it enables those key decision makers who may be making decisions that could lead to serious harm, will be thinking quite carefully at the time of the decision making, rather than further down the line when the harm has already happened. And of course, with environmental destruction, that's actually really important. Now, progress of this work has been very rapid in the last year or so. There are now 20 countries which are members of the International Criminal Court that have discussed or are discussing this issue either at parliamentary or at government level. And the Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, has remarked that he considers this definition an excellent starting point for government discussions. And we have recently submitted a statement to the discussions going on in Geneva at the moment around the biodiversity framework, encouraging perhaps some wording on this as a potential enabling condition for moving that forward. And in the United Nations Environment Assembly, the wording was also surfacing from various places, from the Global Major Groups and Stakeholders Forum, also from the Youth Forum, and crucially in the opening and closing addresses at the Assembly from the UNEA President and also the head of UNEP, Inga Anderson. So this conversation is very much live globally and moving forward rapidly. And we're also finding that even the business community, the financial community, is starting to begin to take notice of this and actually to call on governments to collaborate to criminalize ecocide, to create a framework that can begin to provide stability and harmony in their decisions. So that's really fascinating too. And in the light of today's webinar, it's actually really interesting to know that this is a women-led movement. It was in large part inspired by the pioneering UK barrister Polly Higgins, with whom I worked very closely and co-founded Stop Ecocide International. And our approach is very much a collaborative one. Sometimes more establishment figures have been known to say to us, why don't you keep the law for the lawyers, the policy for the policymakers, and the public campaigning for the grassroots? And of course, what we've realized in practice is that actually the more connectivity we create, the more we collaborate with different groups, the more the conversation cross feeds between different sectors and between policymakers, NGOs, corporates, grassroots groups, and so many others, the faster this conversation develops. Because of course, that is also the conversation that the media pick up on and that the politicians then pick up on. And that feels to us to be, in a way, quite a feminine approach, very much collaborating. And just to finally close my intervention, the first head of state to support this conversation on the international stage was a woman, and that was Prime Minister Fiame Naomi Mataafa of Samoa, who delivered a beautiful supporting statement at our event at the International Criminal Court last year. So I'd love to hand over to the other speakers and look to hear more about women's involvement in this work. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Jojo. That was an excellent introduction to where we are legally with trying to assure that we can stop ecocide. So, and on that note, I would like to present our next speaker, Stephen Donziger. Stephen Donziger is an attorney based in the United States. He's in New York, and he's most known for his legal battles that are ongoing against the corporation Chevron, particularly in relation to a case that has been going on for decades in Ecuador for the destruction by oil development, initially by Texaco and now Chevron and the Lago Agrio area of the Ecuadorian Amazon. He represented thousands of indigenous and campesino communities in a class action, and has been now battling himself against Chevron due to his very talented, creative, and effective litigation in Ecuador, as attaining one of the largest, well, I won't go into too much. Anyway, Steve, I don't want to, you can speak for yourself. Steve attended Harvard Law School, and he has been also a reporter and done a lot of work in United Nations activities, particularly in Iraq. So, Stephen, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Emily, so much for inviting me, to everyone who put the panel together, who does this important work. Jojo, thank you for your excellent presentation, and to my fellow panelists, it's an honor to be included. And thank you for the kind introduction. Listening to Joe, I've admired, by the way, the work of Jojo and her colleagues and Polly Higgins. It's really monumentally important, in my view, as a lawyer, that ecocide be accepted as rapidly as possible as the next atrocity crime. My experience as an American lawyer in the Amazon of Ecuador, I've been down there over 250 times, if you can believe it, working on this case over the last 25 years, is that what Texaco did to Ecuador. Texaco is now Chevron, by the way, because Chevron bought Texaco in 2001. Is really the very definition of ecocide. They basically went into the Amazon. I'm going to talk about this for 2 minutes so you can get a feel for what went on down there. They went into the Amazon in the 1960s, and they engineered a system of oil extraction that was deliberately designed to pollute, with clear, foreseeable knowledge that the pollution, the dumping, the systematic dumping over years of billions of gallons of toxic oil waste would kill people, would cause cancers and other health ailments that over time have actually killed hundreds, if not thousands, of people. We don't know the precise number because, as is typical in this industry, they never wanted to fund a health impact study or even an epidemiological study to sort of figure out the precise impacts. But there have been some health evaluations from some third-party independent researchers that have shown dramatically increased rates of cancer. And I can say from my own personal experience, from people I know, from my visits to the various indigenous communities and farmer communities, the number of people who have died and who continue to die is off the charts, and I would estimate it's in the thousands of people. If the Texaco executives who designed this system had to put into their decision-making calculus the fact that they might be held criminally liable, personally liable, under the definition of ecocide that the excellent panel that recently came up with, I'm not so sure this would have happened so easily. I'm not even sure it would have happened at all. I mean, they probably would have extracted oil, but they would not have deliberately created 1,000 waste pits gouged out of the jungle, into the side of which they installed pipes that ran oil waste right into rivers and streams that indigenous peoples were using for their drinking water. The people down there do not have faucets like many of us do where we live. You can't just go to the faucet and get water. You drink water out of rivers and streams, and almost all of these in a particular area of about 1,500 square miles over years of systematic dumping were poisoned. Not just the water, but these were sources of food, of fishing, of bathing. And the worst part about it, in my view, when I first went down there in 1993, is it was done deliberately. I saw literally lakes of oil in the jungle. It was apocalyptic. I couldn't believe the human condition was such that people would actually make decisions to do this kind of thing. Of course, I was probably a little naive. I was a young lawyer back then. I've learned a lot since. And over time, we put together a team. By the way, I get way too much credit for this case. There was a whole team of lawyers working on it, including some fabulous Ecuadorian lawyers, Pablo Fajardo and Juan Pablo Sanz and Julio Prieto, Alejandro Ponce among them. And we all worked very closely together. I'm not an Ecuadorian lawyer. I did not appear in court in Ecuador, but the reason the case was in Ecuador is because Chevron, it was initially filed in US federal court against Texaco. Chevron insisted the case be in Ecuador, and it was transferred down there by US courts on the condition that Chevron accept jurisdiction there, which they did. And we pulled together a team. I was responsible for lots of things, strategy, fundraising, but we worked very collaboratively across cultures, across borders, and over a really tough litigation over 8 years that was hampered by blatantly corrupt and unethical acts by Chevron to kind of sabotage the case. We ended up prevailing and won a very large judgment on behalf of 5 indigenous groups and about 80 farmer communities in the amount of roughly $10 billion. This decision has been affirmed on appeal in Ecuador by the Constitutional Court of Ecuador and by the Supreme Court. There's a civil court and a constitutional court. It's also been affirmed by Canada's Supreme Court in a unanimous decision for purposes of enforcement. Chevron, by then they owned Texaco and they were defending the case, refused to pay the judgment. They basically said things like, we're going to fight this until hell freezes over and then fight it out on the ice. We got an email where their strategy, rather than pay the judgment, was to demonize Donziger. That's me. And I have literally lived the last 10, 11 years dealing with their demonization campaign, which involves the use of 60 law firms and approximately 2,000 lawyers to attack me and my colleagues. I mean, they literally have spent 2-3 billion US to attack us rather than pay the people they poisoned in Ecuador and comply with the law and comply with the court judgment that they won. For me, it's been a real ordeal. I am now, today is my 959th day of detention in my home. This is my Manhattan apartment where I live in a 2-bedroom apartment with my wife and 15-year-old son. I've worn an ankle bracelet, a GPS tracking monitor on my body for almost that entire time. They put me in prison, a federal prison in Connecticut for 45 days where I was locked down in a very high security kind of situation. And I have another, 4.5 weeks before my sentence ends. It ends on April 25th. And at that point, I guess I'll be free again if they don't come up with anything else. This is really scary. I know one of the topics today is how do we defend Earth defenders? How do we defend the people, the lawyers, the activists, the campaigners on the front lines? I mean, we all know, every year there's 200-300 people literally murdered around the world for doing environmental defense work. People who obviously suffer fates far worse than the one I'm dealing with right now. What's so bizarre about this, I think, are a couple of features. I mean, one is not to overplay my own country, but like the fact that the United States, which is known as a rule of law country, generally, would lock up one of its lawyers for this length of time on basically a pretext is quite frightening. And it's this new phenomenon you see in the United States, you see it in many countries around the world, of slap lawsuits, which are lawsuits designed by powerful companies to silence advocacy, silence lawyers, silence activists. And what ended up happening with me, to make a long story short, is Chevron, after we won the case, sued me here in the United States, claiming we obtained the judgment by fraud. They paid a witness $2 million or more from Ecuador, flew him up here. He claimed he was in a meeting with me where I approved a bribe of the trial judge. Totally false. There was zero corroborating evidence. It did not happen. They had sued me in civil court, and they basically prosecuted me as if they were the federal prosecutor, but it was a civil case because no normal prosecutor would ever prosecute me. And they came up with these, fake criminal charges about bribery, extortion. And they denied me a jury, and a judge who has financial investments in Chevron and who's a former defense lawyer for the tobacco industry found me liable for these supposed crimes. And then he later demanded that I pay Chevron millions and millions of dollars, even though I never got a jury, to reimburse them for the legal fees they used to create this fake case against me. And when I couldn't come up with the money, because I just don't have that kind of money, I'm a human rights lawyer, the judge ordered that I turn my computer and cell phone over to Chevron. I appealed that order. It would cause me to violate my ethical obligations to my clients, disclose confidential information and the like. And he then the judge charged me with criminal contempt of court. The prosecutor refused to prosecute me on those charges. And he then appointed a private law firm, a corporate law firm here in the United States by the name of Seward and Kissel to prosecute me. And this law firm had Chevron as a client. I was prosecuted not by the US government, which wouldn't prosecute me, but by a private Chevron law firm, which proceeded to have me locked up at home as a supposed risk of flight. COVID hit, I couldn't get a trial. And I was literally sitting here for 2 years and 2 months with an ankle bracelet on a minor misdemeanor charge for which the longest sentence ever given a lawyer who's guilty, and I'm not guilty, was 90 days of home confinement. It's pure political retaliation in my view. It's been confirmed by the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which issued a beautiful opinion, 5 jurists last September, which called for my immediate release and for me to be paid reparations by the US government. We've repeatedly demanded President Biden, our Attorney General, Merrick Garland, intervene and take the case out of the hands of the private Chevron law firm and put it in the hands of the Department of Justice. They have not done so. So, a couple of points just before I wrap up here. Number one is being able to do the work to hold major polluters accountable is critically important, not only to get justice for the people harmed and poisoned, but to save the planet. If we can't function as lawyers and advocates in our legal system and have the tools to hold these polluters accountable, the destruction of the planet is going to accelerate even more. And I think that's where my work and the work of the people really pushing the Ecocide overlap. We need to protect offenders. We need to have the legal tools needed to hold these major polluters accountable. So at the beginning of the process, when they think of the contracts they're negotiating to access supply around the world, they are thinking, wait a second, we have to invest more money in doing this in a way that won't pollute or will mitigate pollution, rather than just literally deciding to dump toxic waste intentionally, as was done in Ecuador, and which is still killing people today. 50, 60 years after those decisions were made, when laws were not on the books and the people making those decisions never thought they would be held accountable. The irony, of course, is they were ultimately held accountable. We won the case. The people of Ecuador won the case. The indigenous peoples won the case. And they are using what to me is a corrupt corner of the US federal judiciary to try to distract attention from their environmental crimes by focusing it on me, and also using me as a tool to try to intimidate other lawyers and activists from doing this important work. So that's my story. I hope it was of benefit to y'all. I know it's kind of a bizarre story, but the final thing I want to say is I hate, a lot of people hear this, are like, oh my God, we can't do the work. They get demoralized. No. I really want to emphasize that we the people of Ecuador won the case. And the reason this is happening to me is because of our success. So I just want to emphasize that. And thank you very much for the opportunity to share my perspective.
Thank you, Steve. It's just so incredible every time I hear and process your story, your situation. It's just like from the Twilight Zone, right? Anyway, it is also the victory in Ecuador, I would like to comment, has been the basis to inspire many people throughout Latin America in particular to resist oil development. And I live in Costa Rica, and Patricia may mention this in her presentation, based on the experience in Ecuador. And we brought people from the Amazon region and films and educated the local public in Costa Rica, where oil concessions were granted, to decide that this was not for Costa Rica, and to declare that oil exploration and development in Costa Rica is not viable, and we're able to terminate the concessions. So I just wanted to let you know that your work has inspired many of us across the globe. So thank you for that. Okay, so our next presenter, Deanna Ziller, is based in Mexico. She's the executive director of the environmental justice and human rights organizations. Do you say JADE or JADE? I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but I'll call it JADE. Her work focuses on putting into practice integrated approaches for environmental and social justice claims. She's had broad experience throughout the region, supporting throughout Latin America small-scale gold mining certification process as an alternative to mega projects in Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, and has been an advocate working with the Alliance for Responsible Mining. She's also been part of diverse United Nations projects and programs fostering environmental governance in Mexico, which, as many of us know, is a major challenge. So she has studied abroad in London and Amsterdam, and she constantly applies, and she'll tell us about how gender-sensitive methodologies have been effective in her work in many cases throughout the region. So thank you very much, Deanna.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very honored to be part of this panel. I'm going to be sharing with all of you my presentation. Let me know if you can see it right. I'm also apologizing. My English is a little bit rusty, so I'm sorry for that in advance. Okay, so I'm going to be giving some facts about ecocides in Mexico, and I'm also going to be sharing with you today some experiences led by women, basically frontliners that are currently working as environmental defenders. I'm sure many of Latin American attendees are going to feel like there's a lot of similarities. Mexico right now is considered the second country with highest attacks on environmental defenders after Colombia and Brazil. So I'm gonna start my presentation saying that ecocide as a term is still not acknowledged in any of our laws related to the environment. And the closest concepts related to ecocides that are currently being used are environmental crime, environmental damage, and that's very recent. We have this very interesting law that is a recent creation called Environmental Responsibility Law, that is the one pushing for the environmental damage concept to be applied in our penal courts, in our penal system. So environmental crimes in Mexico, as in many other countries, are basically understood as claims and complaints and allegations, and somehow remain diminished by the system. In terms of environmental crimes that have been registered in the last years, we have had an increase, except for, as you can see in the graph, 2020. And that's kind of interesting because that's during the COVID peak. So the decrease is actually because of the shutdown. So there was no access to justice, basically. So even though that year and the year that follows, the environmental crimes that were registered decreased, we actually also have experienced attacks on environmental defenders of the highest number in 2020. So that shows that during 2020 and 21, decrease on the environmental crimes registered are not real numbers. So I'm going to be sharing some experiences led by women, basically frontliners. And these are, well, we can say small cases there, but I think we can see examples of what's happening on the ground, and that helps us try to understand how on the ground an ecocide law can become reality, right? So I'm going to start with a case in Chihuahua on the north of our country, because it has to do with indigenous communities. We work with this issue with the JADE network, basically because illegal logging there is linked to organized crime and drug dealing bans. So that makes this type of cases very sensitive, very delicate, and women defenders there are discriminated, and they're treated as liars, and they have very, very little support. So the case here started in 2018, and illegal loggers just go on and invade lands. Communities just hear chainsaws, and they don't know what to do. So that's the starting point. They don't know what to do. So they seek for help, and usually they find some other NGO that will help them report the crime. And this case was also a woman leading in that NGO. So there's this group of women who report this crime, and the authorities just don't believe them. Still that the illegal logging keeps going for about a year, and nothing happens. Authorities, after some months, went to the scene and did nothing. One of the criminals was caught, but then was released. And the indigenous woman kept reporting, trying to find evidence, which is very hard in these cases. Many times they're even the authorities may ask them to respond for themselves. They don't believe that they're outsiders doing these invasions. So anyways, there has been no justice. Their livelihoods were just taken away. Another case that also explains a little bit what's happening on big cities. It has to do with natural protected areas, natural reserves, that all of a sudden authorities decide to have a land use change, right? That's very common. And so this is a case where a 5 million city people that's industrial has very few green spaces, and all of a sudden the authorities give away to the private sector a piece of that natural reserve. So women groups start opposing this type of projects and this type of procedures by the authorities. And the private sector is meant to develop a soccer stadium. So they start legal action, they start mobilizing, they question the environmental impact assessment, they demand public consultations, they get experts involved, and still the demands are ignored and the projects get approved. So this is very common. At the beginning, when they were saying that Jojo was saying, this is for women, this is highly frustrating, right? And this is an example of this. Another example that is very, very recent it's about the coastal development natural reserves, which basically are building additional docks for massive cruises. And this is maybe like a few weeks ago, a month ago, that they started a campaign from women-led groups in Quintana Roo and Baja California. So basically, what they were opposing the additional docks being built. Basically, what happens here is that the environmental authorities are approving development projects of this sort. So women-led groups are questioning them. It's like, you're an environmental authority, you're supposed to protect our environment, our livelihood. So again, they demand consultations, nothing was happening, so they just began campaigning, and they did this amazing campaign just a few weeks ago, caught media attention nationwide, where they actually exposing the environmental authorities as corruptive institutions, because well, they still approving these ecocidal projects with no environmental impact assessments, or else that they're not allowing access to the information. So okay, this is very, very recent case. Another case down on the south is in Chiapas. Chiapas, I mean, I could talk for days about Chiapas, but basically this is also a woman-led case where experience, also about land use changes of a biological corridor of a natural reserve. And this has to do with all of invasion for housing. That's also very common in all over the region. Women here also started legal action, and they, in this case, they were trying to make the developers and the authorities see the value of the ecosystems and trying to convince them that there could be other strategies where they could respect the environment. But again, nothing happened, and authorities just give any kind of excuses to avoid the following up processes on the following up on the due processes. So women-led groups here are talking a lot about corruption and private interests taking over the development in their region. So I asked Cynthia, her name is Cynthia here, how she felt as a woman defender, environmental defender, and she said that usually she feels like she's treated as a crazy woman, and that many times she's advised not to be involved because it's not of her business. So, and at the same time, she ends up doing the work that should be done by the environmental authorities. So last case here is just about the coastal reef disease in Quintana Roo. And this one is interesting because in this case, there was a woman inside the environmental institution that was collaborating with the woman-led groups to defend the coral reef that had the stony coral tissue loss disease. So they were, along with the Marines, they decided to close down the region to protect the reef. But then there was this group of opposers that turned out to be mostly men, and they do mostly illegally sourced activities. And these opposers threat the life of the woman that was leading inside the environmental institution. She didn't have any support from the institution. On the contrary, she was harassed out of her job, and she ended up moving to another state with her family for safety reasons. So there's also these kind of cases where there is action inside environmental authorities, but again, as women, we are not being able, they don't allow us to do the work. So I'm going to start closing up by saying that environmental rights defenders in Mexico fear that violence will increase if they report a crime, and that the figures around environmental crimes are not real. There's a lot of impunity that doesn't allow to the numbers to be known. And well, illegal logging is mostly the most common case of ecocides, and indigenous communities are the most vulnerable. Obviously, women, indigenous are the most vulnerable of all. So just very quickly, SEMDA, which is one of I would say the most important NGO on environmental rights in Mexico. They do a lot of environmental defending support. Women are suffer physical aggressions, environmental defenders, I mean, physical aggressions, trespassing, threats, criminalization, defamation, homicides, harassment, intimidation, robbery, stigmatization, kidnapping. I mean, you name it. We're really suffering, experimenting a lot of obstacles to be able to defend land and ecosystems. I'm not going to go through this list. I actually did this, and at the end I was like, well, so there's so many things to say that are factors that result in ecocide that I had to write there others because the list goes on. But I have to point out impunity. I have to point out corruption, lack of law enforcement, and institutional capacity. I think a lot of countries in Latin America, we are experiencing the same obstacles to report ecocides. In terms of access to justice and women's community-based organizations, all of the organizations that we've been talking to and working with are always saying that they suffer discrimination and they're not being consulted. They have no access to information and fear of threats. And anyway, and again, impunity is the most common term discussed when talking about this. And I'm going to just close with a quote from one of the women I was talking to, that was campaigning for the corruption of the environmental institutions. She said, if we talk about climate justice, we need to consider social justice and gender justice. It's a utopia that we need to pursue. So we still have hope and we want to do this, right? That's why we're here. That's why we're all, well, it's a woman-led movement. So I think that's very inspiring, and we still want to get this done. Thank you very much for
thank you,
giving me
Deanna.
this space.
Yeah, every example that you mentioned, Deanna, is example that I myself have worked with or lived on and seen so many times over and over again. So particularly your example on, I think it was in Baja or Nuevo Leon, I can't remember, where you were having the protected areas being changed to industrial use or big projects. And recently, many of you heard about the Wapinol water defenders in Honduras that had a similar situation where a national park was corruptly granted mining concessions and started destroying all of the water of the downstream communities. Another example over and over again, and the communities were criminalized and et cetera, et cetera. So unfortunately, this is reality in many, many areas that we work in. And it's great to hear that so many women are standing up and defending their resources. So another thing that you mentioned was access to information, which is key. And that's one of the main topics that our next speaker will be addressing. Patricia Madrigal is a Costa Rican attorney, and she was the environmental Vice Minister of Environment and Energy in 2014 to 2018, and was instrumental negotiator of what is known as the Escazú Agreement. Escazú is a town in Costa Rica where it was finalized. So she is also a professor. She's taught at the University of Costa Rica, and she graduated postgrad from University of Alicante in España, and has been professor for various US universities working in Costa Rica, and including the UN University, University for Peace, which is based in Costa Rica, excuse me. So she has been actively also drafting legislation and worked for years on the World Resource Institute International Environmental Law Yearbook, and many other things that I'm not going to go into. But Patricia is a wonderful friend, compañera, and thank you, Patricia, for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Emily, and thank you for all the organizations that came together to have this webinar this morning. Well, for me, it's morning. And
yeah, very early morning.
Very early, yes. I would like to talk about the Escazú agreement and gender approach, if Emily can help me with the presentation. The Escazú agreement is the first environmental treaty for Latin America and the Caribbean. And this treaty aims to improve the minimum standards for access to environmental information, public participation in environmental decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. ECLAC is the secretariat, and it has been ratified by 12 countries and entered in force in April 22 of last year. Next.
Yeah, I'm trying to do, there we go.
Okay. It's important to mention that the day that we adopted the text of Escazú agreement was Berta Cáceres' birthday. Berta is a leader from Honduras that was assassinated 2 years earlier for her defense of the Lenca indigenous people and the opposition to hydroelectric projects in Honduras. And maybe that's why the fourth pillar of Escazú agreement recognizes and protects the environmental defenders. Next. Okay, one of the characteristics of the negotiation process was the significant participation of the public alongside the government representatives. A significant majority of participants in this process continue to be women. Regional public mechanism initially established in 2012, in 6 representatives of the public, 4 alternates were elected to maintain the dialogue with the presiding officers. In the Article 2, in definitions, public means one or more natural or legal persons and the associations, organizations, or groups established by those persons that are nationals and that are subject to the national jurisdiction of the state party. Young regional leaders recognized for their advocacy on environmental democracy. On the 2nd anniversary of the adoption of the agreement, 5 youth champions of Escazú were selected from 58 applicants. These young leaders consist of 4 females and 1 male, as you can see in that poster. Next. The Escazú agreement strengthens the human rights system in Latin America and the Caribbean. The agreement complements other human rights protections, such as Siller. It supports the SDG, in particular Goal 5, to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, and Goal 16, to promote just, peaceful, and inclusive society. Next. We can see a gender approach in the agreement of Escazú. By this definition, also in Article 2, persons or groups in vulnerable situations. That means those persons or groups that face particular difficulties in fully exercising their access rights recognized in the agreement. This definition is the first one in international environmental law to define the vulnerability as a condition, as a special condition to meet the guarantee of the rights. Next. The Escazú Agreement established that states parties take measures with an intercultural and gender approach for the various vulnerable populations so that the right of access to environmental information, participation in decision making, and access to justice can be effectively guaranteed. Guaranteeing access rights is a fundamental element for the empowerment of women and advancing gender equality. The participation of women is not considered in decision-making processes due to multiple factors, including traditional gender roles, the relegation of women to secondary roles in public affairs, the lack of access to information and culturally relevant communication, as well as the lack of recognizing women as landowners in many societies. In Article 9, we have the consideration of environmental defenders, including 3 important elements to be taken into consideration by state parties. First one, the obligation to guarantee a safe and enabled environment to act free from threats, restrictions, and insecurity. Second, the establishment of adequate and effective measures to recognize, protect, and promote all human rights. And third, the establishment of appropriate, effective, and timely measures to prevent, investigate, and punish attacks, threats, or intimidation that human rights offenders in environmental matters may suffer while exercising the rights set out in the agreement. The first element, the recognition of environmental defenders, relates to the prevention, investigation, or punishment for attacks, threats, or intimidation that human rights offenders in environmental matters may suffer in the exercise of the defense of human rights in environmental matters. Criminalization of environmental defenders. This refers to inadequate use of investigations, prosecutions, and other procedures within the criminal justice systems of the states, or to retaliate, threaten, harass, punish, intimidate, defame, delegitimize environmental defenders. And we had an example in this webinar. Common manifestations include false accusations, arbitrary detention, smear campaigns used to hinder, prevent, or delegitimize their work. So there are 2 elements included in criminalization: create, change, or misapply criminal law, or punish or hinder lawful and legitimate activity. Women environmental defenders, as the presentation of Deanna that we just heard, this situation has been highlighted by the increased criminalization of indigenous leaders defending their territories and way of life. Women are attacked for being leaders or members of social movement, with a series of cases of death threats for opposing extractive industries. 227 people were killed in 2021 for their defense of land and environment. Latin America has become the most dangerous region globally for human rights defenders on environmental use issues. Although the number of murders registered against women appears to be low, they face gender-specific threats and sexual violence. Women often face a double challenge: the public fight to protect their land, water, and environment, as well as often invisible struggle to defend the right to equally demonstrate within their communities and families. Often women have to face also a triple challenge due to male partners, leaders, arbitrary detention, disappearance, or murder by assuming responsibilities to provide for family needs and assuming the leadership roles to defend the rights. The Escazú Agreement, in addition to being a legal tool, has become a regional movement from the bottom up that will prove essential for its application. In the Latin American context, women and girls perform a crucial role in collective organization and mobilization that promote progressive societal changes. Thank you very much for this opportunity. You can also be part of the regional public mechanism. You can support this Escazú Agreement, and that's the link to be engaged with this movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for being up and active at 5 in the morning and speaking English as well as listening in English. I'm now going to try to learn how to turn off my share screen. Let's see. Maybe Charlotte, you can stop share. Okay, great. So thank you to everybody that we have now about 25 minutes for questions and answers. I see that there have been many comments in the chat, a very active chat. Many of the participants have been chatting with the panelists. I would just ask, I'll just highlight a couple of things that are easy, quick. Steve, if you could share in the chat maybe what actions people can take to support your struggle and the struggle of people in Ecuador against the major ecocide in the Amazon region with the oil companies. People are asking how to participate. Also, Jojo, I don't know if you saw the question about lifting the corporate veil, if that's what Ecocide will be doing as formalizing Ecocide. I don't know, I don't see anybody with their hand raised. So maybe Jojo, you can start with some of the active chats that I see that you've been doing in the answering people. Thank you.
Yeah, somebody was asking about whether Ecocide could apply to policymaking decisions. There is potential for that, in effect, in the sense that what this definition looks at is prior knowledge, as in is a decision taken in the knowledge that it could create really severe harm to the environment. So, longer term, one can envisage a situation where that could apply. We also had a question about existing provision in the Rome Statute, which covers war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. And there are some parts of the statute that sort of partially or potentially address environmental issues, but the reason that we aim for a new crime is because all the current existing crimes there are human harm related, and actually a lot of environmental damage does not necessarily, although it can often, but it does not necessarily involve human harm. And so that was hence the sort of framing around a new crime. It'd be also nice to just mention a couple of things in relation to the Escazú agreement, because we definitely feel that these two legal initiatives are very compatible and mutually reinforcing. I mean, in particular, around the kind of framing of environmental defenders, simply putting in place the criminalization of serious harm to nature does quite a serious reframe of environmental defenders, who currently, as was mentioned both by, I think, by Patricia, but also by Deanna, in quite a detailed way, is that environmental defenders, and particularly female environmental defenders, end up getting criminalized and described as the criminals in a situation. They're seen as interrupting lawful business activity. Now, of course, if a crime of ecocide is in place, then there's a whole great big question mark that is then put over whether an activity is actually lawful. And so the reframe is potentially from being a sort of somebody who's criminally obstructing lawful activity to somebody who is actually a moral upholder and defender of the law. And that's quite, conceptually, that's quite a big flip. And so that there's a really strong potential there to support what the Escazú agreement does in terms of the rights of environmental defenders. And also, of course, then becomes a tool for those environmental defenders to use, to point at, to potentially wield in the situations that they're dealing with. And I think one final point around the relationship with, particularly within Indigenous cultures, that I think again is a sort of a kind of framing conceptual issue, which is that there's something very profoundly understood, I believe, by Indigenous cultures, which is that there's a almost a sort of, there's a universal law of reciprocity. Effectively, you know, if we damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. That's just a fact. That's not something we decide, you know, in our heads with our sort of legal and intellectual heads on. That is simply a fact that we're seeing playing out in ever more sort of apocalyptic ways. And sort of, so to sort of reflect that at quite a sort of foundational level in the legal system, I think is actually a very important reflection on a very present reality that is becoming, that is very, very evident to many cultures, particularly in, for example, in the Latin American countries, but is becoming more and more obvious also to us in the sort of in the Western North. Thank you.
Thank you, Jojo. We do have a series of questions that have been posted on Q&A, so I'm going to address those as they've come in. So I'm going to read one from Angelica Hoffman. Is it true that the military is totally out of any UN papers, discussions, negotiations, etc.? With all the resources consumed, even in non-war times, not speaking about the damage during wars, have you in your work ever heard about similar problems connected with the military? Is her question. And I would add that other comments in the chat are saying that war is ecocide per se. So I'm not sure if who wants to address the military actions as ecocide. I'm not sure, Jojo, if you want to say something or if someone else would like to comment on that.
Stephen, maybe as well.
Stephen, unmute.
I'll defer to maybe Jojo can kick this off, and I might have something to add. But the whole issue of whether military carbon emissions are, I don't know that issue at all. So I'm going to defer to Jojo on this one.
I have to say, I'm not familiar with the exact situation in regard to carbon emissions from the military and whether that's included in COP discussions, as somebody was raising in the chat. What I would say is that in relation to ecocide, well, there are two things here. One is that the sort of target of that crime, if you like, is natural persons, individuals, rather than any given sort of group or organization, whether that's military, state, corporate, or whatever. It's actually aimed at individuals who make decisions or commit acts that threaten severe harm to the environment. So I see no reason why that should not be applied in a military context, at least not on the face of it. And I think the other thing as well is that the current provision under international crime for environmental destruction, there is some under war crimes, but it's very difficult to prosecute. It talks about severe and long-term and widespread harm. So it has to be all of those things, but it also has to be disproportionate to the military advantage gained. And of course, that is something that is decided by the perpetrator. So it's actually very difficult to pursue that legally. And I think the other aspect that comes in here, and that is an important part in terms of taking forward ecocide as an additional crime, is that the whole sort of idea, in a sense, is that it applies at all times, not just in times of armed conflict. Because I completely sympathise with somebody in the chat saying that, you know, all war is ecocide, and you know, and that could very well play out in practice. But of course, the problem, in a way, is that the extreme edges of what we consider economically to be business as usual are also ecocide, and continue and continue and continue. You know, and it's actually that repetitive, peacetime, all the time approach that doesn't put that guardrail around itself. You know, that's what actually effectively requires us to put the guardrail in place.
Yeah, thank you, Jojo. That relates to the next question is, and this would, I assume, be towards Deanna and Patricia. Is there a place where women-led land and climate change defense groups can register their causes and challenges so that we could together have more accurate data regarding number of national and international law and human rights violations? I'm going to first ask Patricia if she's aware of anything, and then Deanna, maybe you can add something.
I remember there is a network by I'm looking. Go to Deanna. I'm looking the link.
Deanna, unmute, please.
Well, I don't have the links in right now in my head either, but what I can say is that there's different groups that are based by regions, and you can either find women, just gender movements and gender groups that would help, that would support, or you can find also in the environmental sector. Unfortunately, there's not that many spaces where both issues are looked at. So that would be actually a good thing to work on, you know, where we can have environmental defense and women-led groups to join. I think that's one of the things we really will be really important, so we can work on this, right?
Yeah, that's an important question that was asked by Cristina Balcazar. Thank you. I'm going to quickly, as we're running out of time, hit the next couple of topics. Marty Smith for Patricia. She's wondering how the Escazú agreement may change or strengthen the generalized principle of free, prior, and informed consent, which many of our countries have in our constitutions in Latin America.
I think it will strengthen the regulations for a prior and informed consent, because the Escazú agreement established a minimum floor with the regulations that the country has to have about access, to guarantee the right to access of information and to participation. And in case that those rights are not sufficiently guaranteed, you can have an access to administrative or judicial jurisdiction or any action in order to comply with the right to access to justice, environmental justice. And the register of environmental defenders that I was looking, it was an effort of 50 journalists that has a website, Land of Resistance in Latin America, and they are a documentary and the life and the cost and the struggle of environmental leaders in America. That's a way to recognize and to publish the work that all these people is doing.
Thank you, Patricia. In the chat, it also mentions, Luis Romain mentions that the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, We Can, also engages women and feminists across gender spectrum worldwide in advocacy. So Jeannie Mir has a question. The International Association or a comment of Democratic Lawyers and many of its affiliated associations are interested in working to support the rights of environmental defenders. What do you suggest for ongoing communication between yourself and our organization? So it seems like many of these questions are very similar. How can we get more people actively involved in these similar with global and local consequences efforts?
Could I maybe address that?
Sure, and Charlotte as well. Thank you, Steve.
Sure. I think that's an excellent question. I mean, in my experience in Latin America, you know, it's very, an international network of lawyers, the group that Jeannie leads or helps lead, has enormous, I think could play an enormous role in creating a system where when the defenders get in trouble, they get represented or connected to an international network of lawyers who can speak out about them and offer protection. It just cannot be overstated how important it is for people on the ground around the world who often work in local communities with virtually no connection to, you know, the larger networks that we access, those of us on this panel are able to access, how much that can help and how much it can force governments and or just whatever to protect people. And also to access mechanisms, legal mechanisms, you know, through the human rights system, the Inter-American Court of Justice, to force governments to, you know, create, you know, emergency measures to offer security. I think that is something that is practical and could really be done, even just a press release. As you guys, I know, do, Jeannie, already for a lot of people, but I think that kind of thing can really, really matter.
Evelyn, would you like to add to that? Thank you, Steve. That's
thank you, Emily. Yes, I'm also in this association, so I fully support what Jeannie is proposing, and I think we will work on this issue in a practical way as we've done in the past, and we will continue. But I have two questions. One is for Patricia and one is for Jojo. For Patricia, as far as I know, there have only been 12 countries that participate or agreed on this Escazú Convention, and you have altogether 27 countries, if I'm right. This is the question for Patricia. And for Jojo, there is a question. I mean, it took a very long time to get the other crimes like genocide and crimes against humanity to be incorporated in the Rome Statute, and where, you know, the starting point at the Nuremberg trials. I have to remind you, Rolf Lemkin and Hirsch Lauterbach, and of course, Philip Sands in his work. So what is your perspective of, you know, getting this fifth crime included in the Rome Statute? Thank you.
so thank you, Evelyn. Why don't we quickly, Patricia, maybe you can clarify where we are on this new Escazú agreement advocacy for signers to ratify.
Okay, yes, we have 12 countries that has been ratified, and the main challenge is to promote the ratification among the other countries. Chile just started the process of the adoption of the agreement with this new President Boric. So as the political changes are coming to Costa Rica, Colombia, and Brazil in the next months, we'll see what will happen with these countries. And we are still promoting the ratification at the Caribbean area, which the proceedings are a little different, and maybe we can go a little bit faster there. But we are all aware about this main challenge to have more countries.
Thank you, Patri. Jojo, do you want to quickly comment? And then we have a couple more questions in very few minutes. So.
Yeah, just very briefly, in terms of the timescales, one of the advantages to approaching the Rome Statute at this point is that as the statute is already in existence and there is a sort of a set procedure for amending that document, that is potentially much faster than trying to establish a completely new treaty, which, as you quite rightly point out, can take a very long time, and even adding a crime to the statute can take a number of years. But it's also important to note that the climate, both the political climate and the literal climate, of course, have changed considerably since that was last done. And actually there's an urgency now that is present both in the public discourse and at the political level, which means that we anticipate probably within 4 or 5 years that this could be being adopted. And of course, with the urgency of what we're all facing and environmental defenders are facing, that can feel like a long time. But at the same time, it's not that we can't afford to wait that long. We can't afford not to do this. It actually must be put in place. And the other aspect of that, of course, and I mentioned this briefly in the chat earlier, is that actually being able to see it coming is a really important factor, so that policymakers can see this coming down the line, which they're already starting to do, and that investors and insurers can see this coming down the line, and it will affect what they're prepared to underwrite or where they're prepared to put their money. That actually is something that starts being affected now, and that strategic change actually happens in that space between understanding that it's coming and when it gets adopted. And actually that's a really important and fertile period for creating that change.
Thank you, Jojo. I'm going to put on the chat for everybody, but just wanted to mention that there are a couple of global organizations, including the Environmental Lawyers Alliance Worldwide, which is particularly working on advocacy globally. So what Stephen was mentioning about the IADL, the Environmental Lawyers Alliance Worldwide, for 30 years has been building a movement of specialized lawyers, public interest, to support communities facing ecocide. So I will put that up, and I see also that someone pointed out AIDA for Latin America, which is the Association of Inter-American Defense of the Environment, and they have noted a web page that has to do with climate change litigation. There's also one on the ELA webpage as well for climate change litigation. And let's go to one last question before we conclude. Belinda, will the criminal liability focus at restoration of the environment or imposition of fines? And if fines are imposed, what measures will be put in place to ensure restoration of the environment rather than the reallocation of resources to other activities? I'm not sure if we're thinking of the World Court here or our World Criminal Court, or are we talking about in individual countries? I don't know. Jojo, do you want to try to address that? Or
I mean, I would say that we're sort of somewhat at the early stages that, you know, the crime itself has only just been defined, and the sort of sentencing and restorative justice aspects potentially could be further down the line. Although I would also note that the European Law Institute is working on a definition of ecocide for the European context, which will be kind of aligned with the international definition that I talked about earlier. And they are specifically addressing restorative aspects as well as sort of corporate aspects, whereas obviously the International Criminal Court focuses on individuals, which brings me to the other point that you mentioned, which is that actually people could be facing jail sentences, not just fines. And that's actually a good part of what's of the incentivization here is actually if your personal freedom is on the line, you know, that's a very different issue to be thinking about than whether your company will have to pay a fine. And that is a good part of the power of this.
Great. So I would like to especially thank Evelyn for putting this together. She's worked day and night. So thank you so much for putting this together and bringing us together and stimulating us all to think further about these important issues, including the, I can't stop thinking about what's going on in Ukraine, thinking of ecocide, every kind of side you can think of, but just want to take a moment before we close to respect and support our colleagues, the women who are defending their homes and families under such circumstances. And thank the forum for approving this important topic. Evelyn?
I think Stephen wanted to say briefly something.
Yeah, I don't know if we have more time. I'm just going to say real quickly to build on something Jojo said. I mean, I would argue that the work on the ecocide law is already having a big impact around the world. It's already entering the brains of these executives in the fossil fuel industry. The projects they're planning today, by the way, go out 10, 20, 30 years, and they're thinking, where am I going to be when these projects become operational? So I think it's already having an effect. These things never happen overnight. They happen incrementally. They seep into the consciousness. They start affecting how people think and how people act. And I think it's already protecting people. So, you know, I have no doubt, by the way, I've said that I think the question of ecocide is the legal battle of our generation, is the battle of our time. It has to continue to develop momentum and become, you know, the next atrocity crime. So these things are already happening. I've noticed it in our lawsuit, you know, even though the peoples of Ecuador haven't collected yet, the fact that they won the case is affecting behaviors by these big companies down in the Amazon in a very significant way. So we have to keep perspective, right? These changes sometimes take a long time and they happen often imperceptibly or little by little, but they're happening, and it is really happening. And the final thing I'd like to say, and I think this is so critical about the ecocide law, is, you know, private actors, corporations have had a free pass for far too long. You know, most human rights law is designed to hold governments accountable for human rights abuses. And, you know, to sort of extend that to private actors such that decision makers could have criminal liability, could face jail terms, I think is a sea change in how we can really help better protect our planet and better protect the rights of vulnerable communities who are the frontline defenders of the planet and who suffer the worst impacts from these contaminations.
Thank you, Steve. On that note, unfortunately, we must end as we're, Evelyn, would you like to say anything besides thanking us all?
Of course, I'm thanking you. It was most exciting and informative meeting, and I think we must carry on with our struggle wherever we are in associations, and we should link more each other together and see the intersectionality and the holistic approach we need to follow these issues. That's what is important, and I'm sure you all agree, and we carry on. Thank you so much for all of you to join this event, and we will carry on. Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, ciao.